Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, featuring timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert. Today, ISF CEO Steve Durbin is in conversation with the retail doctor, Bob Phibbs. Bob is recognized as a leading expert on brick-and-mortar retailers, and he has consulted for, among others, Caesar's Palace, Lego, Omega, Vera Bradley, and Yamaha. Bob shares his perspective on digital transformation in the retail market, building a solid team, and effective communication within an organization. Here's Steve.
Let's start, Bob, right in your primary wheelhouse, which is retail. The retail space over the last, 18 months or so, I guess, through the pandemic has been pretty horrendous for a lot of retailers. What's your view on the outlook for retail coming out of pandemic?
Well, I think we're in for a once-in-a-generation holiday this year. I think people have been pent up. They want to get back to their lives. The challenge is that supply chain is giving us a tough time. But at the end of the day, this has all the earmarks of a lights-out holiday, because already in the U.S., the malls are crowded with people with bags. I mean, it doesn't look like what we would expect in start of September, that's for sure.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because you're talking about people physically going out shopping. And one of the trends that we've seen is people moving away from that and going online. So are you saying that we're going to see people going back into a brick and mortar type environment?
Oh, absolutely. All the traffic from Placer AI and others has all shown that, the figures we're watching is the increase over 2019. And Starbucks, other big brands are all noticing that they are up double digits over 2019, which is very encouraging all the way around.
And how are retailers gearing up to respond to that? Because certainly when I talk to some of our retail members in the UK or across Europe, for instance, one of the challenges they're facing is staffing. How's that going to shape out?
It's interesting. On my Facebook page, I was asking a question, and this woman said, well, I can only pay $12 an hour. So how am I supposed to compete with Target and Walmart that are charging $15? It's like, you pay $15 or $16. That's what you do.
Right.
You can be penny wise and pound foolish, as my dad used to say. If you're really going to think it's a cost, then you don't see employees' investment. And that's what I'm seeing more and more, is that a lot, as much as they plead, I can't get good employees, when you actually read what they're looking for, must be friendly, must be outgoing, must have worked in retail for 2 or 3 years, must be, oh, and we'll start you at $10 an hour. And you're like, really? And then you go and see that they're leaving these people alone. So they're expecting friendly employees, but they're not giving a team to work with. So there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, this idea that, everyone has suddenly decided they're not going to get a job in retail, and all these people have decided, look, the good ones have jobs. There's no two ways about it. However, what I think it's more endemic of, Steve, is the reality that what we're not seeing is young people coming into the workforce. That's the bigger issue. It has nothing to do with retail. When mom and dad are keeping your home and you don't need that job. When I was 18, it was like, see ya, I'm gone.
Right. And
got into a small apartment and did whatever I had to. Well, that isn't necessary now. And so what do we do when, someone is looking down on going to work at Starbucks or retail or a number of other ways? Where are they going to get that life experience? And ultimately, that's where retail has always been the biggest driver of success. And you look at almost any CEO, they come back to, they learned it's about somebody else making somebody else's day before they would make their day. And that's what influenced them as they went through. So that's the more concerning issue. And I don't know that I have the answer for it, but I think that's certainly more than a matter of pay and people just aren't out there. It's a function of something a little bigger, I think.
Right. And it's interesting that you position it that way, because one of the things I was going to say to you was that increasingly, I think we all have to be retailers because we're all selling something. And certainly when I say that to people in the security space, the eyes begin to roll and I become one of the less popular people in the room. But it is a fact, isn't it, that increasingly we have to have some of those, as you point out, life skills in order to be effective, irrespective of what we do. So let me put you on the spot a little bit. You said you didn't think you had the answer, but come up with some suggestions perhaps for me, because you've thought about it clearly.
Well, I'll give you an example. So I'm in upstate New York and I'm in the Lowe's in Catskill. And they've closed this is back in June or July, they've closed the garden center registers, which in the middle of the summer when people are planting, you had to go all the way back in the store. And I'm like, really? So over the loudspeaker, it's saying, how about a new career with Lowe's? Go to www.lowes.com/something. I just like, really? That's how you're going to restaff your store. You're going to have people listen. Wait, honey, let me get this. What am I what am get your ass out there. I don't know if I can say that here on your podcast. Get your butt out there. And you go through the line and you say, if you're tired of waiting, if you know someone who would be good for us, here's a QR code. They could scan it. They can apply online. We're having a job fair in 2 weeks, whatever. But you realize the goal of management is staff that store. And people seem to think someone else is going to do it. That's the problem in retail right now. It's like someone else is going to catch the shoplifter. Someone else, well, we don't have to worry about that. Look, thieves have been more emboldened than ever. The stuff we're seeing in San Francisco and some of the other major cities in the US about the shoplifting rings and just brazenly going in during the day and just taking stuff and leaving. It's a huge issue. And ultimately, you're going to have to staff that. If you want to be a business, you're going to have to staff it. You're going to have to find it. But you can't let standards go down and just say, well, whoever can fill a shift. That's what got restaurants in trouble. Is it wasn't end up having somebody who can make a nice evening for you, Steve. It's about whoever will fill a shift.
Right.
So it's boring for me to go to the restaurant. I'm not going to pay your $50 entree to go have that crappy experience. And now we say, oh, well, it's just people don't want to go out. No, we don't want to go out to that. So needless to say, I have an opinion on a lot of things there.
So, I mean, you're talking about a market that's becoming increasingly more competitive. And one of the things that you talk about a lot is the end user, the customer. What I'm interested in talking to you about, Bob, is, and I mentioned it right at the beginning, this issue of emotional connection with the brand, because that will get some retailers through some of the issues that you're talking about. If you're talking about Starbucks, if you're talking about Apple, if you're talking about some of those marquee type brands, then people have an association with them. And so arguably they'll put up with some of the things that you're talking about. But similarly, those kinds of brands are going to work even harder to overcome it because they're very concerned about the value of that brand. But emotional connection, how do you establish that? And how do you keep it?
Well, your North Star has to be, it's all about the customer. That's why smart retailers are always, there's at the boardroom, you hear the stories about there's an empty chair. It's the customer. What do they think? What do they do? Face it, I'm in the motivational speaking and in the training side. All my training is online, salesrx.com. And, I'm training tens of thousands of people around the world. But most of the people don't want to train employees because it's hard. What if I train them and they leave? How are we going to know if it works? All this other crap that they have given up on, and they just say, oh, it doesn't matter. But if the ones that do matter understand, I need a branded experience when someone comes into my store, and there's a certain amount online too, but online, let's face it, your emotional connection to a brand online is much less, which is why they're all going to influencers and all that other stuff to try to give it a personality. But the brand, if you realize when someone is willing to make the trip to leave their cocoon and put on a mask and get in their car and go to the store and roll the dice when they walk in the door, and nobody's there and nobody says a word to them and they have to endure whatever they're going through, right? It's like, oh, well, I just want to get this stuff and get out. Well, the opportunity opens for somebody else to say, we can do it better. And I'm telling you, the new crazy idea is understanding we are in the new great reconnection of humans. Those who get it are working really hard. They're coming to me and saying, how do we train our employees better? How do we go through and hold them accountable? How do we make sure that what we provide in Wisconsin is the same as in Florida, is the same in London? And those who don't, I think, are struggling. And so they're falling back on discounts and a lot of other things that don't matter. Look, all that matters is your North Star is people who feel they matter buy more. That's simple. That doesn't happen by a coupon. It doesn't happen. Yeah, it's nice to have a pretty display. But in the end, it comes down to a human meeting another human being. If you don't have that, then you are pretty much a warehouse with stuff. And that's why, a lot of high streets are having trouble right now because they haven't really changed over to realize, oh, it's a different way. It's not the 50s. They can go a million places to get the same thing they get with me. What's the only thing I can compete on is the experience in my four walls. And that's not a rock climbing wall or some other silly, there's a basketball court or all this other stuff. It's human to human.
And that's something that the pandemic has robbed us of, isn't it? And so the opportunity is there because people are actually craving some of that interpersonal interaction. And so by providing that, not only are you going to give a good experience, but that's going to make sure that people will keep coming back. And the other thing, of course, that anybody in a sales environment will tell you is that you want people to be happy because they tell other people good stuff about you. And then more and more people come back. So it's the power of word of mouth, isn't it? So it's that connection piece.
Absolutely. But again, notice that people didn't go running back online. In fact, Amazon stock went down after their last announcement, how e-sales are falling. Zoom is falling. That this idea that we're all going to be remote and we're all going to be shopping online isn't holding water. The malls are coming back in droves. The Milton Keynes out there of the world and the other really great places. Yeah, they might have high vacancies right now, but they're figuring it out because people go to be with other people. And to your point, when that's been robbed of us, it's like the bank account is overdrawn. We have to go out there, which is why the malls are doing better. Are we out of the woods? No two ways about it. But everybody wrote off department stores. Oh, all department stores are dead. No one will ever go there. Well, it seems like they're coming back pretty well. In the UK, it's a little tougher, but I read a story the other day. It was like 1 in 7 department stores have gone out of the UK. Well, what about the 6 and 7 that are still doing great?
Right.
Why don't we have that story? But right now, retail is the one to kick and say, no one will shop and apocalypse now. And it's just a sad narrative but that fear of retail is going away or everyone's going to be doing this is a narrative that will not go away in the future. So if you're a retailer and you're listening to this, realize that that's not going to change. No one's going to say, oh, retail is back. It'll always be, but, or, Lululemon's doing great, but, and I'm just one of the few passionate people out there that believes that brick and mortar has a huge place in the world. We can change the world by people working and shopping in retail. And it's that simple.
And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast was really because of some of the views you're just expressing. And the link for me, because there may well be some people listening to this who listen to this series on a regular basis who are sitting there thinking to themselves, Steve, why are we talking about retail? Normally you touch on security issues. What's all this retail stuff? Have you bumped your head or what's going on? But for me, you see, the challenge that you're talking about, that retailers are starting to overcome, is really very close to the challenge that security has had. In that, security has had to work somewhat in isolation for a very long period of time. People have not wanted to talk to security guys because they've always been perceived to be preventing them from doing things. They haven't been able to facilitate support, growth, and so on, has been the perception. And that's why I'm so keen on this whole issue of sales, of emotional connection, of supporting growth and providing support mechanisms. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is about trying to make this linkage between the challenges that retailers have been facing and the challenges that security guys have been facing. It is about customer outreach. I talk a lot about the need for security to treat its users as if they're customers. For instance, why do you want people to come back to you again and again? Not so that you can tell them not to do something, so that you can give them an experience that helps move them forward, that helps them develop the way that they're transacting business. And so there's a parallel between why do you go to a retailer? Because it makes you feel good, not just because you pick up the product you want, but you have that experience. And so there is, I think, a need for us to begin, as we go back into our work environments, to continue to build out this notion of service as being one of the key differentiators that we have, irrespective of whether we're talking about retailers, whether we're talking about security, whatever it happens to be. I know you're not a security expert, but from a business standpoint, is that something that you think is going to make a difference? The notion that, and you mentioned physical security there with shoplifters, but this notion that with cybercrime on the increase, with people having to adjust to a new way of working, a security function that is able to provide service as well as security? Is that going to differentiate sufficiently?
So it's no different than the vendors I work with. You've got to be able to come around the table and sit by me and be a running buddy. I think so many people, it's the example I always use is just picture a counter and picture two people on either side of it. And this person is talking to them about whatever it is. Doesn't matter, right? Now I want you to just picture that person comes around the counter and they're looking at it together side by side. Which do you think is more comfortable for the customer? The one that they're side by side with.
Exactly.
Well, that's what most people forget when they're trying to sell whatever it's going to be, because you're still standing with this counter in between you. Well, we have a 5-point plan that'll do X, Y, and Z instead of, so what does success look like for you? And what have you tried to get there before? And what's in the way of you achieving that right now? Would you be interested in some options that I might be able to help you with? Yeah, I'm interested. That's great. But you've done your homework. In fact, I'm pitching a client in about an hour and a half. And I did a lot of research on what they're trying to do because they only told me a little bit. And I don't really want to be on that call asking the same questions as everybody else. I have to say, what matters is you. I think I get you. Does this sound right? And so doing your homework and realizing that at the end of the day, people buy from people they like and people they trust. And the only way you build trust is to build rapport in some level enough that they are willing to say, you're my trusted advisor. So if you said, yeah, it's going to cost, I don't know, 100 million to protect you against cybercrime, they're not going to freak out and say, I can get it for my brother's, daughter's, son's, nephew's, aunt's boyfriend for half that, right? I mean, it's still going to come down to, you understand me, you get me, and I like doing business with you. And how do we do that in a short amount of time when most of us want to send out a quick little email, hey, we can help you with X, Y, and Z. Here, click on our something. It's just gotten harder. In some ways, it's easier that we can find our clients, but in other ways, I think it's harder because everyone has read the 5 tips to cold calling or 6 ways to make people say, or whatever. And so we've all become a little bit more jaded at a time when really our interest to open our hearts to another human being has never been greater. So that person that can stand out and do something different, that's what makes a difference.
So understand your environment effectively. If you're talking to somebody in the business, to your point, understand what some of their challenges are, what they're doing. Think about how you can add value. Don't forget about building rapport. We are people after all, and that is the easiest way of getting your message across. And then the other piece is about just being helpful. It's about how do you move things forward? It isn't about stopping. And I think this is one of the great fallacies in the security space as well, that there's this perception that security is there to prevent you from doing things. It isn't. Security is there to help you do things better, faster, quicker, more securely in an environment that is becoming very much more dynamic.
So why do you think people have that impression, Steve?
I think there's a lot of tradition that goes with it, Bob. I think that, if you go back not that long, a lot of security people have evolved from the physical security side of things. Maybe they've been in the armed forces, maybe they've been in police forces. So this perception of the traffic cop, I think a lot of security is still probably too embedded in a policy-based approach that says, I'm here to implement a policy, as opposed to the policy is there to act as a guideline. One of the greatest pieces of advice that a chief information security officer ever gave me was track the number of times people come to you and ask if they can deviate from a policy, because that shows you that you're actually getting the right message across. They're reading, they're understanding, and they're coming to talk to you because you're approachable about how they can solve a very real issue.
Well, you brought up something that's really interesting, and I've got a whole course of it in my online training. It's on personality styles, and I'm not going to bore you and try to go into a whole bunch of things, but folks who are listening right now, security people, you're all probably analyticals. You're like Spock in Star Trek. You're like a surgeon. You're like anyone on this old house. You're a car mechanic, like a CPA. You have a process. You go to A to B to C to D to E to F to G. And that's great. I'm not like that, though. I'm a guy who speaks in shorthand. Right. And so I gotta go I go from A to M to Z, and another guy like me will be like, oh, I get that. The problem is a lot of times people that are really analytic don't have the soft skills of how do I talk to someone who's not like me. So we make these assumptions that we want a 15-page bulleted report when the person in charge of it may not want any of that. They just want to know I can give it to you and it's gone, or you're going to be able to take the best of what you do because I don't have that. But making the assumption that we're alike, I think, costs you sales. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think it's that empathy piece, and you're absolutely spot on. One of the hardest things I think that we have to try to overcome from a training perspective is that issue of empathy, the softer skills, because there are some people out there, and we've both met them, who are absolutely first class at their job, but they can't get the message across. They don't know how to convey that. And so people perhaps don't warm to them as much as they might. And I think increasingly, certainly from a security standpoint, we need to be building on those skills at all levels, from the boardroom right the way down. And that leads us into the need for more and more training.
It's all about training. I don't care what you sell, whatever it is, it all comes down to training. And if you're not learning something different or trying something different and seeing what happens, what works, what doesn't, I think you get really predictable and everyone's the same. And we make these big judgments that, well, if I just do this, this will happen. And everything kind of, I don't want to be one of those people. Everything changed with the pandemic. But I would say that little kindness, that little bit is not something that if you've been doing Zoom for 18 months is going to come across immediately. Even when we came on here really quick, I normally would have built a little bit more rapport, but it's like, oh, let's get going. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens. And, realizing that I have to stop and pause and make a connection if I want to actually enjoy what I'm doing. That's going to take a little bit of a learning curve back for all of us. I mean, it's certainly happening in retail right now. What do you do with employees who've been masked up, at least in the US? And some states are like, oh, you don't wear a mask and you better not wear a mask. And then other ones are like, we're all wearing masks. And so what do you do when you are the one who's the mask police? And you're like, but I don't want to have this. And you spent 18 months, 19 months with this. And yet they're being told to go out and help the customer and be friendly. When I go into a lot of stores which are not trained, employees are hanging out behind the register like never before. They're afraid of people. Mm-hmm. And I get it. Think of what they went through. So understand that all of us have got that same need. I don't care what you're selling, online, in person, whatever. It's still going to come down to that human connection.
It is. And how do you go about, or how do you suggest overcoming some of that challenge? Because I see that, we're talking specifically about retail here behind the cash register. But the issue is the same with people, say, returning to the office. We have a similar sort of challenge there about the fear. How do you think we can help people overcome that not just from a business perspective, but also from a sheer personal standpoint?
Well, it does have to come from the top. I think that, if you're trying to lead people, you need to realize that before I ever go through and pitch an idea or come to somebody's cubicle or we start a meeting, we take some moment to just understand that we need to connect on some level. Some people are doing 1 minute little games that they're playing or different things to get people to say something or do something. And I think that could be perfectly fine as people come back to work. But, there's also generational things going on here. I mean, millennials and Gen Zs, the ones most afraid of going back to the office. Google today just announced they're not going to go back till January. They keep pushing it back and pushing it back. Whereas it does seem like baby boomers are the ones are going to be coming back sooner. So there's got to be sensitivity in that and just understanding that not everybody's like us. I think that's the big thing that we take from this is in everything we've seen here, certainly in the US, not everybody thinks alike. And how do we find our way through this? Because everything that's being shown us is they're not like you and you should hate them. And that's not good for any business.
It's been fascinating talking to you, Bob, and drawing some of these parallels between the world of retail, the world of security. Before I let you go, what do you think? Put your sort of stargazing hat on for a moment here. What do you think the world is going to look like 5 to 10 years' time? And what are some of the challenges we're going to have to deal with?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I think one of the more interesting challenges is going to be young people are going to be brands from an early age, and they're all going to be much more entrepreneurs than ever. I think the idea of what college provides, what paths look like for the future have been blown up, that people are able to be an influencer or they'll be able to do all these different things. They can have a little niche hobby. And the overriding drive that my generation, I'm 63, baby boomers would have had, which is we are going to constantly keep working so that we can finally retire. I think that is going to be turned on its head. We're going to find people who are going to want much more balance. The average consumer got back 2 hours a day when the pandemic hit. And I think people suddenly rediscovered hobbies and being with their families and doing kids, and certainly pets has exploded. I don't think that's going to go away. And so this balance that we're going to come back to is going to be really important. But at the same time, to your point in security, I think that we are going to see people more and more try to find their way through exploiting all of the always on consumer. And that's going to be something that it doesn't matter if you're a retailer or whatever, that, Apple's already trying to work on that. A lot of other companies are trying to look at it. But the challenge with that is, of course, you're going to be locking down the information on some sides, but someone's going to be able to crack it and see it. And where does that bring us? So I'm hopeful. I think ultimately, we are about as happy as we make our minds up to be. I think people realize that they had to make a choice. Either they're going to be fearful and spend the rest of their lives cocooned and they're going to be afraid, or they're going to say, I've gotten the vaccination, I'm going to go and I'm not going to let fear run my life. And in that respect, I think it could be a great time. Certainly doesn't feel like when I grew up in high school in the 70s and we had gas rationing and it felt like the end of the world was here. So I think that would be something to consider as well, that this generation is going to be much more hopeful. We are making so much progress around the world on more people coming to the table and different voices coming. Young women are seeing all kinds of role models that never were out there for 20 or 30 years ago. And I think it's all a great thing, and how that ends up, I'm looking forward to seeing what it is.
Plenty of opportunity, plenty of change, and plenty of interest and excitement going forward is what I'm hearing. Bob, been fantastic talking to you. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thanks to this week's guest, retail doctor Bob Phibbs. Next week, we're speaking with Mel Shakir, Managing Director of Dream It Ventures, about his work helping cybersecurity startups reach their full potential. Here's a preview of that conversation.
CISOs, they talk with other CISOs, of course, right?
Right, of course they do.
And building that, if you have some traction with any other CISOs, that CISO is likely to know, if they're in the same region or in the same industry vertical. It's a small community. There's a very good chance that they may know each other. So, talking about that credibility that you've already built with the peer CISO, I think that is really important.
We'll be back for the full interview in a week. In the meantime, is there a topic or a question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode? Let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you'll find our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. Find us on LinkedIn by searching CEO Steve Durbin or Security Forum. Follow our audio feed wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll never miss an episode. And if you like the ISF podcast, we'd love it if you'd write a short review. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert, with music by Alexander Filipiak. Associate producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.